everyone, my name is Ariana Reyes and I am the Community Education Specialist for the Compost Education Program. And today we're going to be talking about the wonders of vermicomposting. But before we get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about what we do. So our program teaches composting to schools and children and to adults at our weekend workshops, virtual and in person. And we also attend events such as Earth Day and Festival Gardens. Now, the great thing about vermicomposting is that there's no backyard required, so this type of composting is accessible to most. And a lot of people actually have a misconception that composting requires a backyard, but it doesn't. All you need is food scraps and paper waste products, and it's neat, easy, odorless, and fun. Vermicomposting is cultivating worms to eat our food and paper waste products. It produces a really great fertilizer for our plants that's full of nitrogen. There is a specific type of worm that we need to use for vermicomposting, and this is called the red wiggler. Now, the red wiggler is special because it likes to hang out at the surface of the soil where it's nice and moist and where we put our food scraps. Now, we like to use red wigglers for this reason instead of earthworms or other worms because those type of worms like to dig down deep into the soil where the plant's roots are. And they do their own job with the plant's roots and the soil deep down, but for this reason we want the red wiggler worm. Now, there are many other insects that you might see in a worm bin. Personally, these three pictured are the ones that I typically see in my worm bin, which is slugs, roly-polies, and earwigs. Now, these insects do not do any harm to the bin or the worms itself. However, sometimes some insects like fruit flies might be a nuisance to you personally. The only insect I would say to be a little bit careful of are centipedes. If you see any centipedes, try to remove them from your worm bin. So, worms are hermaphrodites, meaning they're both male and female, and they lay little cocoons that are yellowish in color, and they're very, very small. But if you see any of these, just know that one cocoon can hold 3 to 5 baby red wiggler worms. So the first step to vermicomposting is finding the correct bin system. There are two different types of bin systems that you can get. You can get an affordable DIY version, or you can buy one off the market, pictured to the right. Now, the one that you get off the market usually comes with 4 legs, a spigot for catching excess liquid, 2 catching trays, and 1 feeding tray. If you get the one on the left, which is the DIY version, make sure that it's solid in color since worms do not like the light, and make sure that you also put some holes into the side of the bin. Here's a good example of a DIY homemade recycling system. Now, you'll also notice that they put holes at the bottom and 4 legs to elevate the bin off the ground and catch the liquid better. You'll also notice that there's a lid on top because, again, the worms do not like the light. It also helps to retain moisture inside the bin, which the worms need to survive. Here are some things to know when choosing bin size and some extra worm facts. Now, worm bins can be any size. Usually ones off the market are good for a standard family of 4. However, you can always get a bigger bin or a second bin if the worms aren't digesting your food quick enough and if you see that your worms are reproducing at a rapid rate. The worms will reproduce to fill the box, but they will not overpopulate. You can always get away with too large of a bin, but it's a little bit tricky when you get too small of a bin because you do not want to overfeed your worms. If you overfeed your worms and the worms cannot keep up with the amount of food scraps you're putting in your bin, it can attract fruit flies and you can get some pretty bad odors. So we want to avoid that. The worms can eat half their body weight a day and they can reproduce at 2 months of age. They can double their population in 3 months, so we recommend starting with a pound of worms, which can either be purchased or donated by a friend. Feeding your worms is going to be a trial and error process. Noticing that your food scraps are disappearing in your worm bin is a good sign that you're feeding your worms at a good rate. You should start a second worm bin or get a bigger worm bin if you notice that every time you feed your worms, you have too many food scraps and they're not disappearing. Building the worm bin. Bedding is very important for your worms, and it's very important that your bedding is nice and moist. I like to use shredded newspaper print as my bedding for my worms. You want to make sure that you're fluffing out your bedding, and you want to make sure that it's as moist as a wrung out sponge. I recommend putting 4 to 6 inches of bedding as a starting layer for your worm bin. You can also use shredded cardboard from pizza boxes, cores from paper towels and toilet paper rolls, but just know that cardboard is a highly valuable recyclable material, so if your cardboard is in good tact, it's best to recycle it. You can also use shredded office and junk mail paper, dried and partially decomposed leaves. Just make sure that you are avoiding anything plasticky and glossy inserts. Food scraps that are really great for a worm bin are vegetables, fruit. The smaller you cut your pieces, the easier it'll be for the worms to break down and the faster you'll get compost. Pasta and cooked beans is really great, coffee grounds with a paper filter, tea leaves, tea bags, paper towels but without any chemicals, and eggshells and cardboard egg cartons. However, try to avoid getting the styrofoam ones because those will not break down. Those will just sit in the landfill for a long time. Also, since the worms don't have arms or legs, the worms use the eggshells as a form of grip to help them maneuver around the bin. Here are some examples of food scraps that I'm adding to my worm bin. Banana peel, here's an avocado skin, and here's an avocado pit. I like to add it to my worm bin. Even though it takes a while for it to break down, it doesn't bother me and I kind of just leave it in there until it completely breaks down. Some items to avoid are animal products such as meats, bones, and fish, dairy products such as cheese, milk, and yogurt, pet waste from carnivores. We welcome herbivorous pet waste though, such as hamsters and birds. Those are all okay to put in the worm bin. We want to avoid oils because they can clog the skin of the worms, and we want to avoid plastics because they won't break down. Be careful with bread for folks with mold allergies, and avoid seeds and nuts with hard hulls and shells, although it's a personal preference and I just include mine. They just take a very slow amount of time to break down. Avoid large amounts of acidic and pungent produce such as lemons, limes, orange, ginger, onions, and garlic. This is too acidic for the worm and can harm the skin. Yard clippings are best to put into a backyard composting bin, so it's best to avoid putting these in the worm bin. Also, they can be too woody or branchy and they'll just break down really slowly in the worm bin. You can also add soil, however small amounts are okay. If you add too much, it's only going to weigh down the bin and it's really not necessary. Now remember that your worm bin needs oxygen for the worms to breathe and to promote aerobic bacteria. And also the worms need water to stay nice and moist and to help the organisms in your bin. If you chose the DIY system, it's going to be a single layer. Then you want to look at the one on the left, which is 4 to 6 inches of bedding material on the bottom. Then you put in your food scraps and worms, and then you add some more layers of bedding on top. And then you have the lid. Now, if you got the system that you purchased from a vendor or a different source, then yours is going to be the stack system on the right. And this one comes with 2 feeding trays and 1 catching tray. Now, the one on the left is going to be the top layer on the one on the right. So the very top layer has the 4 to 6 inches of bedding material, then the worms and food scraps, and then some more bedding material on top. And underneath the first layer, you'll see that there's holes. The 2 feeding trays have holes so that the finished compost can kind of migrate towards the bottom. All of the excess water can be collected at the bottom using the spigot, and this is the differences between the 2. When you know your compost is ready, it's going to look really dark brown, almost black in color, and it's not going to smell, and you won't be able to identify the food scraps that you put in originally. You can use a sifter to sift out the finer finished compost, or you can spread out a tarp and put your finished compost into clumps using a hand shovel, like the picture shown. By doing this, you are using the light to your advantage, and the worms are going to clump up in the middle of these clumps, and they're going to try to escape the light. Here you'll see that I used a small shovel and did the clumping method. As you can see on the photo on the left, I clumped them into 3 different sections, and as you see on the right, all the worms migrated to the middle of the clump to get away from the sun, so then I just grabbed that clump of worms and put those back into my worm bin. You'll also see that there's a lot of eggshells in my finished compost, but I don't mind them, and they actually add a really great source of calcium to your garden. And that's it. Some takeaways to consider are that it's going to be a trial and error process. There's different types of worms. Make sure you get the red wigglers. The bins can be any size. You're creating an environment for red worms to eat your vegetable, fruit, food, and paper waste, unrecyclable products. It's different than a backyard compost pile because you're managing worms instead of bacteria. There's no turning or chopping required. It produces a really great nitrogen-rich fertilizer, and you're reducing your food waste and carbon footprint. It's also neat, easy, odorless, and fun.